Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, it's another week where I'm super excited because we've convened what I call the podcast panel, which is people who've been on the podcast who have agreed, if you like, or are just ongoing, continuous learners. And it's a community of learning, if you like. And we convene once a month. It's pretty open-ended. Whoever's got the time or the inclination or the wherewithal to be able to engage and come in and just basically pose some questions and then explore what the answers we may have or may not have, but at the very least, have a good go at seeing if we can't help each other out with some of the challenges that we face, and record it all as we do it for posterity and to help others. So on the panel this week, very, very pleased to have Loren Anderson from Rise Volleyball all the way over from the States. Loren, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
And I know you're just about to go into a massive tournament, which you might want to talk about in a minute. You've got a busy few days ahead. David Hinchliffe, live from north of the border in Scotland. David, welcome back.
That's right. Sitting in a car park in a Scottish school, just about to do a Friday night session with a local club. So. Hello. Yes, indoors, thank goodness, because it's raining, as it always does in Scotland.
I promise not to do any more Scottish weather jokes, I really do. And Edward Coughlan, the world-famous Dr. Skillack, who is over there in the Emerald Isle, which is, we're just about to put a giant wall in between us at the moment because we're just about to crash out of the European Union and create a giant border wall. So, Ed, good to have you.
Thanks, Stu, and hi to the other guys. I actually went on to that EU petition to Article 50 today just to check the numbers. Yeah. So it was over 3 million. And let me see if I can even put my name to it. But no, not allowed.
Well, as you remember, but because from the European Union, you're not allowed. You're not allowed. Oh, unlucky.
Not allowed. I have
That's
to
a
be.
Shame. I'd have welcomed your. I'd have welcomed your intervention there. It went from. You know what? It did 1 million today.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So it was 2 million at the start of the day. It's done another 1 million.
And I see that the government have to discuss it when it gets over 100,000. So it has to be tabled at Parliament. So it's well over that. So.
Yeah.
But
anyway.
Look, it's been nice knowing you. And
yeah, I'll be applying for my visa now for when I come over and see you later.
Enjoy life back in the 1400s.
Right, less politics because people don't want to hear any more about Brexit. We get enough of it on our news channels over here. Right, so we're gonna go round. Loren, you're furthest away in terms of mileage, so we'll come to you. And also, you were the first to arrive. So, hey, what's on your mind, and what have you got going on, and what's your what's sort of in your headspace at the moment that you want the panel to consider?
Well, sure. What's going on is we're kind of in the middle of our team. We are looking at a tournament starting this morning. Actually, here it's what is it here? 8 a.m. And we are headed off to a tournament that encompasses about 700 teams across 9 or 10 different levels. And we have 3 teams here this weekend playing in it. And then next weekend we have 2 teams playing a little bit in the same tournament, but different divisions. So the tournament is in Spokane, Washington. I'm currently just across the Idaho border in a small town called Post Falls, Idaho. I'm in a hotel that's along a beautiful river, and just got done walking my dogs along the river, and I'm ready to discuss my question. So my question for everyone who really, I mean, obviously for you 3, but anybody who feels like they can help with this, because this is an area that we're really exploring, is on the idea of the visual. I'm trying to move away from using the word training, but the visual training of our athletes, and how we can encourage them, help them to see better, to see things that need to be seen to be better at volleyball. And while I do believe, I'm sorry to all of you listening and to the people here on the panel, but I believe volleyball is the greatest sport ever. So if I'm biased in any of my comments, I apologize. But I think there's a visual component, obviously, to all team sports, and I want to learn how other sports encourage their players to cue in on the correct visual information, so that maybe we can steal some of those ideas to make what we're doing better. Because I think we do a lot that's oriented around that. And as I've said many times, I don't know that anything that we do actually affects the outcome of whether they are learning it or not. We get some kids who get it. They start to see the right things. It completely changes their game. We get a lot of kids who don't. And I'm not sure that either of those is a result of our interaction with them. So I'm just trying to kind of fish for some further information on it.
Just as a bit of clarity, when you talk about the visual information, would it be also accurate to say the perceptual information? And that's not to say that perceptual information is necessarily different from visual, because visual would be part of that perceptual information. But I'm also thinking that a lot of people in the skill acquisition, ecological dynamics space will often talk about, the visual array, the auditory array, the kinesthetic array as well. Are you talking about all forms of perceptual information beyond just simply the visual, or is it just the visual?
I guess I would be referring to the general field of perceptual information. I think, our sport of volleyball is probably, I don't know a percentage, but it's the vast majority of information that we are hoping our athletes are paying attention to is visual. But because all of that is, linked and coupled with all the other perceptual information, we can't really separate it, I guess. So I think that while we are cueing them almost specifically about what they're seeing, it certainly encompasses all of it.
Okay, great. And then so the other thought I have, the question of clarification, which is probably useful, is in what brings you to conclude, or at the very least hypothesize, that what it is that you do has no effect on those that either get it and those that don't?
Wow. Definitely not a conclusion. More a frustrated guess. Mm-hmm. In that, I've been coaching for 27 years and been pretty much always using the same form of communication or of teaching when it comes to this idea. And we get a very small percentage of the kids who come through our gym who really truly get it. And I think I could go into the details of like what exactly we're trying to talk to them about when it comes to the sport of volleyball, but I'm not sure that that's
it probably is worth doing it a little bit, just because I think it would help I think it would help to illuminate the challenge a little bit more.
Okay, so I mean, I can just point out maybe a few examples of things that we would be asking our athletes to focus on. So, serve receive. The other team is serving. I hate to always assume people understand or have seen or even like the sport of volleyball. But I think everybody knows there's a net and there's a team on the other side that's serving, whether it's 6 people or 2 people. And under being able to attune to the correct information from that server, to be able to, instead of the very typical beginner, I wouldn't say beginner, I see it even in advanced players, but a very typical thing is for players to simply stare at the ball. Across the net, it'll be 60 feet away, you've got somebody serving a volleyball to you. And I think we see 2 reactions. We see the players who will stare at the ball and then not be getting all the information they could be getting from the server. Or we see people who kind of have that wide general gaze over there where they're not really looking at anything. They're looking at everything. And that one also doesn't seem to help them prepare for what happens next. And so when the ball gets served, they are only reacting to what the ball is doing. And because it comes at you so fast that by the time it's, halfway to you, you've finally got a little bit of an inkling about where it's going. And you're trying to play catch up. The kid is trying to catch up to where the ball is going rather than already having determined pretty well where it's going. And all of that is based on the cues from the server, being able to, the server's body is like this incredibly rich source of information about where the ball is being served to. And so many of our athletes struggle to be able to, number one, look at the right things on the server to be able to determine what's going to happen. And then number 2, to be able to make good decisions based on that information that's coming in. So that would be probably the most basic example of what we're talking about. And it happens when an attacker is hitting the ball, anytime the ball's on the other side of the net and the opposition is playing the ball, there's so much information that can be pulled from the visual source in front of you. And yet so many players really struggle with those 2 things, looking at the right things, but then also understanding what they're looking at is telling them.
I think sounds. Sorry, go on.
Jump in, David. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say that, especially that serve example, sounds very, very similar to a situation when you are batting in cricket. You have to get the visual information from the bowler as he delivers the ball. You have to decide what to do, and then you have to, obviously with the cricket bat in this case, you have to strike the ball in a direction where there's no fielder. So that decision-making process is very similar, I would say.
Yeah.
And how you decide what to do is from what you perceive.
Right.
But the difference, I suppose, one of the differences, I suppose, although I think the task is remarkably similar.
Yeah.
One of the differences, if we're just framing the task, which is always a useful thing to do, I think, is that in a cricket context, firstly, the ball is actually more often than not going to bounce, and you kind of want it to. Whereas obviously in a volleyball context, you're trying to stop it from doing so. But the second thing as well is that the ball's coming from a lot further away and you do have a lot more time to react to it. Whereas in cricket, it's less than a quarter of a second in some cases, isn't it?
Yep.
So there are some subtle differences, but the task itself is very, very similar in the sense of there are these perceptual cues that we are picking up from the action that the other person is taking, which can be more or less helpful to us.
Correct. I was wondering off the back of that whether, the specific thing that was mentioned there was getting the cue from the server, and in a similar way, you're getting the cue from the bowler's action. So similar thing. So in that respect, though, are there other cues that some people can relate more to? In other words, are there individual differences between people that mean some people are more inclined to get more information from, say, the shape of the server as they serve the ball, compared to, you know, the ball, being able to track the ball by looking very intensely at the ball, and you can get more information more quickly by doing that? And are there individual differences there? Or even the sound that it makes? I mean, the sound that it makes might be quite interesting. I know with when we do catching practice with cricket, we use bats with a rubber face on the front of it, and they make a very different noise to the sound of a cricket bat hitting the ball. And I think that makes it a bit harder, or it appears to anyway, make it a bit harder for the fielder to take the catch, because that sound is a cue. That crack of the wood against the ball is a different sound for what you get when it goes plonk off the rubber bat. So you sort of lose that sound cue, and it makes it more difficult. So I'm wondering if we can't say across the board, oh, everybody will be better if they use those visual cues. It might be that some people will, but other people might get better cues from other things. So I'm wondering if there's, you know, if maybe it's a need to be a bit more individualized.
Jump in here, Ed.
Yeah, I think it's a great question for starters, Loren, because I think it's something that we've all kind of tackled at different times when at different stages of coaching. You know, how can we improve their ability to anticipate actions a little better? And I think all of what we're talking about here speaks to that. You know, there's quite a lot of work out there now at this stage, either between, you know, the video-based work, you know, Abernethy and Farrow, Mark Williams, Mac Roberts, and all that kind of stuff from the cricket and the soccer domains that talk of this kind of advanced cue utilization. And I think one of the things that we need to be better at doing for that research is to move from the research into the practical domain of where someone like Loren on a court, or David at the crease, or me on a course, or what, you know what I mean, that we're actually able to extrapolate exactly what does it mean when we say, oh, elite players are able to read these advanced cues better than non-elite, and they're not looking at the ball, they're looking at some proximal or distal body movement. And I think a way of doing that is to try and in some way replicate the research work in the applied setting. And there's a really nice example of how that's been done in the past, with where Zoe Wimshurst was asked to do some work with Ronaldo, and all her videos are all over the YouTube about the work they did with Ronaldo. And basically what that day that they had Ronaldo in the lab, they basically tried to operationalize research questions that had been asked previously about occlusion paradigms and so on and so forth, and anticipation work and advanced cue utilization. And I think the next stage on from that is for something like this, because it's something I did in the past with tennis juniors, about this idea about what I want you to start looking before, because what I heard from you, David, there, that idea of the bat and the sound of the bat, for me, I think that's, and I agree with everything you said, but I think that's almost too late. That's not advanced enough. The ball's already been hit at that stage. And I think what I got from what Loren said at the start there was the idea of how can we get them better at anticipating before the slap of the hand on the back of that ball to serve. And one of the things we've done in the past is to get people to either serve we've done it in a few different sports, but the most obvious one has been in tennis and in table tennis, is that we've asked the players to do the service action that they really believe they're about to do, and do not have a ball in the action, so that the players are not going to then get distracted by trying to watch the ball. And what they're asking is, so like in your example, Loren, it would be to ask a server to serve and be very clear in their mind what they want to serve. And they do the full action of the ball being thrown up, and then they execute the serve and for the players on the other side to be able to try and, predict, almost like a game. Like, I think you were going long with that one. I think you were going cross court with that one. I think that was a topspin one. I think that was a floater. I think that was so that we're removing the ball a bit like those occlusion paradigms, be it a temporal or a spatial occlusion paradigm. We're removing that. So we're really asking of the players who are watching the serve or the bowler or the whomever it is to watch those cues before the ball is hit, because that's where all the rich stuff is. That's what the evidence is telling us, that the really good stuff happens in this advanced cue utilization, these postural cues that give away so much information before we ever take a penalty in soccer, because the way the hips or the feet are placed and so on and so forth. That's something that in some way to almost have as a suggestion to operationalize what the research is telling us. Well, try it in a practice session where the research shows us a runner running up to the crease, and just before they bowl, we remove their arm, or we remove the ball, or we remove a body segment. In your real world setting, Loren, and the kind of stuff that I've done in the past, where we get someone to execute a serve without the ball, and then we get the players on the other side of the net to say, "Oh, I think that was," and it's only for periods of time. You'll run several of them, and you'll ask them to vary the type of serve they're doing, to not hit the same serve all the time, so that the people are being able to distinguish, oh, that was a topspin. Oh, I see what you did with your wrist for a topspin compared to what you do with your forearm for a side spin or a floater. Because I think one of the problems that I had a few years back, and it's a problem, and it's a question that comes up quite a bit with our postgrads here, is how do I get the information from the research papers onto the pitch where I'm going to coach later tonight? And I think it's one of the things that we've done in the past to say, okay, well, what have they done in the research? Well, okay, they've removed something to then try and identify or sharpen our focus of what we should look at. That might be something that might help some of your players to start looking at those kind of cues, that elbow angle, that wrist angle, that flexion of the shoulder, depending on the type of serve that the person's going to do, before the ball is hit. So take the ball out altogether, let's say, I don't know, does that add anything?
It does, actually. I would have a couple comments. One on David's comment about sound. They actually did some research in the sport of volleyball. I'm not sure if it was someone doing it specifically for volleyball, but they did research that included volleyball players, and they found that the expert players did pull relevant cues from the sound of the hand hitting the ball, and that it actually changed their interaction with the serve, which it was pretty fascinating to me, because we practice in a gym where the only sound, we have 3 courts in that gym, so it's loud, but it's not deafening, and so you can hear the sounds of the server's hand hitting the ball pretty well. And then we go, for instance, today we'll have teams playing in a gym that has like 16 courts, and it's an acoustic nightmare. It's super loud in there, and you really can't even hear your own self think. And so now these players are unable to hear that sound, and they're just gonna struggle. So the research, I don't remember where I saw it. It was just about a month ago, was showing that when you removed that auditorial cue, expert players struggled for a little bit of time, but then made adjustments that allowed them to continue to be great at receiving the serve. So I think there is certainly a part of a high-level player who has learned to adjust what they're doing based on the sounds. I know I do when I play, and I know that if I couldn't hear it, it would probably affect me for a little bit, but what would it cause me to do? It causes me to use the other senses better. So now the visual side of it becomes even more important to me. So yeah, I think that was a cool point that you brought up, and I think that, but I do agree with Ed in that that's the last piece of information that we get, from the actual body of the server. and that everything else we get before that can be tweaked by that sound. So, you know, we see the shape of the person's body, where their hips are facing, what their shoulder and elbow are doing, what shape their hand is in as they serve. All of that is way, you know, let's say that was 90% of the information. And then the sound of the ball and the hand contact might add 5% more information to what I've got. So if I was trying to get a kid to go from being bad at service to being really great at it, I don't think I would even mention the sound to them, because I don't, you know, it's like I want to get the big rocks first, and then I think the sound part becomes experiential knowledge. So
the one of the things that occurred to me, Loren, is I was immediately jumping to how you go about allowing your athletes to, well, first question was, because I love volleyball too, I'm
that's
just
good.
Vertically challenged, and therefore not necessarily particularly my morphology doesn't suit to the game. However, any opportunity I have to play the game, I will have. I'm famed for my volleyball net, which is in the back of my car always, so that I can erect my volleyball court to play 2v2. Obviously, the court itself I make is always really quite small, which again is another area where I can minimize my need to actually run very much. So it all works. It all works. So
what you're saying is you're built to be a setter as opposed to
oh, for sure. Setting is my thing. Oh, yes. I'm not too bad at passing as well. I'm pretty good at rolling around on the floor and making a fool of myself. But the spiking piece, that doesn't work so much when you've got a high jump like I've got, which is more like a very short long jump. Then it doesn't work. Anyway, less about my physical limitations. One of the things that occurred to me was, because obviously you've got a range of different abilities in your gym, and you've got a range of youngsters and all that sort of stuff. So I imagine the various serving styles are quite different. You've got some underarming it, you've got some overhand, you've got some jumping and throwing and doing the full-on, thing that I can't even conceive of. But I mean, is that true? Is there lots of different styles being used?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think if we have 300 kids in our gym, then we have 300 different ways of serving the ball. I mean, even if they all, even if you got 100 of them saying, yeah, we all serve the same way, they don't. So I mean, it's I think it's a truth that you can take into every sport, right? Like, I mean, you take a pitcher in baseball, or and maybe somebody says, yeah, they all pitch the same, but really in all reality they don't. And I think that was my second point when he I think David mentioned that individualizing the process a little bit more. I think that happens on both sides, because with a certain server, the way that they're serving, maybe there's different things you're going to look at based on how that server is serving than another server. If it's someone who is, what we would call like a jump topspin serve or a spike serve, where they're throwing the ball super high and they're jumping as high as they can and hitting it as hard as they can, there's different things there that you're going to want to look at than someone who's standing on the ground and serving it. And so not only is it individualized on the receiver side, in that each individual receiver maybe needs to recognize that they pick up cues differently, but it's also about the individual server and learning what do I need to look at on this server to be best prepared. And I think maybe that's where some of the struggle is, because when you're 16 and you haven't played the game for very long, you haven't learned. You just don't have enough experience to figure out exactly what should I be looking at. And I think, as you were mentioning the visual stuff, one thing that came to my mind is, like, we always tend to, as coaches, we just, because we've played, like I've played for a very long time, I see what that server is going to do. I mean, our national team coach, Karch Cry, often will say, he can be sitting on the bench watching a server or watching a hitter and know before they ever touch the ball where the ball is going, and he could stand up, walk out there, and pass it before the receiver actually even moves, and that's an experience thing, and that's part of the learning process. And so, but with that being the case, what I find we almost all coaches default to is just telling the players what to look at. Look at his arm, look at his elbow, look at their hips. And it works, but our entire gym, our entire philosophy as coaching has changed to this idea of not telling the kids what to do, but guiding them to figure it out on their own. And so that's, I guess, maybe a more specific question on this is, how can we get them to look at the right things without telling them what the right things are and when to look at them?
Well, that reflects back to I was going to just explore a few more areas of it about the dynamics of the game as well, but I'll come back to that. That reflects back to what we talked about a little bit on the last panel, which is how we might use, for example, questions, or in some cases instructions, but in questions, I would use questions in general to draw players' attention to areas of awareness. So, for example, I might often ask a group of players before they've begun an activity. I might say to them, when say like, for example, I might say, what do you notice about where the space is on this pitch, for example? And they'll go, and they'll put their hand up and go to answer, and I'll say, no, don't answer yet. Go and play, and while you're playing, see what you notice, and then when we come back, tell me what you notice. And so the question then becomes, and this goes back to David, one of David's earlier points about questions that I know he's going to come on to talk about a bit later on. So then the answers that come back here is purely and simply, what did you notice? And the only way to get that question wrong, if there is a wrong, is not to have noticed anything because you're just in the zone playing and there's no noticing going on, because the task is to notice something. And I don't know whether that's an approach that because I don't necessarily ascribe to the idea that the kids figure it out on their own. I think they can figure a lot out on their own, but there may be things that they can't figure out unless somebody draws their attention to that area, and then all of a sudden there's something for them to notice. Now we've agreed on an area for improvement. Now, there's what the way I've just described is a verbal approach to drawing attention, but you could just as easily design a practice where the focus of attention is on a particular thing, and a little bit like we were talking about earlier, where you can guess what they're going to do, or you could just design a practice where people get a lot of opportunities to return a serve from a variety of different servers as an individual, so they get lots of looks at serves. I don't know. I'm just that's another way of doing it, but and both of those approaches can work. But I was just wondering around how you go about this. How do you go about giving opportunities for people, for the kids to get enough looks, get enough goes at this thing in order to begin to notice stuff?
By playing.
But playing the full game?
Depending on how you define the full game. I mean,
like a 6v6?
Yeah, no, we don't. I mean, everything we do in our gym is based on the concept of simplify and not isolate, right?
Yep.
So we'll cut the size of the team down, size of the court down, so that there are more opportunities to do pretty much everything for each individual player, but not within the context of the larger game of 6 versus 6, because within that, not everybody gets as many opportunities. So as far as serve receiving, being able to see a lot of serves, there's a ton of serving and serve receiving in our gym every day because we're playing, and there's just everything is started with a serve, and every serve is followed by a serve reception. So I'd say there is a ton of opportunity for that. whether or not the players are, running with that opportunity and working on getting more proficient at it is another question altogether. So, I think one point that you made about I think you referred to it as the verbal approach. What did you notice? And this is maybe one that I've been thinking on, is I've found there's a lot of players who can't verbalize, but yet still can do.
Uh-huh.
You say, hey, what do you think you could notice about the server? They go out and it's pretty clear that they are reading the server. They're moving early. They're going to the right space. They're passing well. And then you come over and you were to say, well, what did you notice about the server? And they're like, I don't know. So I'm sometimes leery about letting their ability to describe their actions be my defining factor on whether they're actually learning.
No, that's a really good point. And actually, that's where the limitations of some of our communication forms come in, because language is one of our primary communication forms. Again, with somebody who is acting based on the perceptual cues, and it's clear that they are, in that context, the question might shift away from, for example, what did you notice? And if they say, I don't know, you might say, well, I tell you what, this is where I might say, well, I tell you what I saw. I saw this. Tell me more about that.
Gotcha.
You know what I mean? So the supplementary question might be in a slightly different way, because you're absolutely right. And I do get that. You get somebody going, almost like, I don't know really. Or, it's either they don't know, they haven't noticed, they're unwilling to articulate it or can't articulate it. Doesn't really matter which of those it is. But it's where I might then probe a little by just saying, well, I tell you what then, why don't we compare notes on what I observed? Mm-hmm. And then you can play back to me what your experience was of what I observed.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does actually. I do like that. Just Ed, going a little deeper.
Yeah, a little bit deeper. Yeah. Ed, sorry.
I think a lot of this speaks to that idea also about how we integrate task consolidation into our sessions. And I think sometimes, and I know I fall foul to this myself, unless I make sure I keep reminding myself this idea of going from one task to the next task in a session. We're going to go to this and we're going to watch this. Okay, we're taking a water break. Okay, we're moving on to this, without taking that opportunity just to gauge where they're at. And it might be any one of the questions both of you guys were mentioning, but almost just as simple as what did you take away from that last thing we did there? Why were we doing that? Why is there anything we might do if we were to go back to it now? Is there anything? But I find myself personally that it's funny, it doesn't seem to have any requirements for age on this. So I'm talking about people who are adult professional athletes and the under sevens who I'd be working with in the morning. The engagement between tasks of what they've done and what they took from it and so on and so forth. Sometimes it leads us to go back in to do the task again, and sometimes whatever. But I have found it to be consistent with what the research would tell us about how to enhance the likelihood of task consolidation, not to do two tasks too close to each other, not to do two tasks without some, and all that kind of stuff. That sometimes it creates, for me anyway, an avenue for just to kind of get an idea, as you were saying there, Stu, all the different ways that they may communicate. It kind of gives me an opportunity to find out, well, what are their ways of communicating? Because again, as you said, Loren, there's going to be people between that procedural and declarative knowledge between which way they're comfortable and how they kind of get it. But by me having my little, and I call it, and literally have it sometimes just a TC, task consolidation. I say to myself, I got a TC at the end of this, I got a TC, because I do forget quite often. I kind of get wrapped up in it. I'm like, okay, well done, really, and then it moves on, and it very much so when it's on the Saturday morning with the kids, because sometimes you can kind of get caught up in the herding cats type of situation, because, you know what I mean, as I think I've said before here, lightsaber fights are breaking out all over the place, whatever. You're thinking, okay, we only have you for an hour, so if I can just try and, but still I'll be like, hang on, just take a beat, just to see. What tends to happen, obviously, as the weeks go on, is I'll begin to pick up how they see the games and how they see the training session. It kind of gives me an opportunity to see it through their lens a little bit, you know. And I think the biggest thing, obviously this is age dependent, at the younger levels, the vocabulary that they come back with, the terms, the words that they use to describe it, are so much more colorful in one sense, which has led me a couple of times to make sure that my questions are very colorful in one sense. And I mean that in both senses of the word. I mean colorful in how they describe things are almost cartoon-like. So I'll actually try my best to describe it almost like a cartoon kind of situation, but also colorful in that just their level of excitement when they do want to talk, I think sometimes gives me an idea about, gee, but they're, like you were saying, Loren, they're not looking at what I thought they were looking at all, but they seem to be picking up something nice from where they are looking. So maybe I can actually create a little game or add a little constraint into that area to see can that aids up even more dust, in one sense, for want of a better word, for them to have to, you know, navigate through a bit more dust in the space. But again, just going back to my original thing, task consolidation for me, and this is almost like a confessional, it's just, I have to remind myself quite a lot, especially at the younger ages, of just that. Take a beat before I move on to something, just to get a dipstick into the water, get a feeling for the temperature here, the depth of how the water is, let's say, you know?
Yeah.
I'd like to do that as well as questioning. I like to do that with some kind of, if you make what you were working on competitive as well, but keep it very specific to what you were doing, then you don't even necessarily need to get the words out of them. You can see whether they're achieving what they think they are able to achieve, or maybe they know they can't achieve it, or they think they can't achieve it, and then you put it into a situation where you're, for want of a better word, putting them under pressure, and then they do it, and then they realize they can do it. So, you know, even something as simple as, you know, a scoring system to make sure that they can see where they are in that process. And then you can, again, if they completely get it wrong, no matter what they think, if they completely get it wrong, you've got that information then. And if they completely get it right, no matter what they think, you've got that information as well.
Yeah. A bit like you were saying, there is no wrong answer for a lot of these things, because it's just more information about them, and it's also more information about the kind of environment that you set up. If they're in inverted commas not getting it, well, then that's saying an awful lot about what you set up in the first place, let's say.
It's made me wonder as well, Loren, and again, without me knowing what I would see in your gym, although I've got a fair idea, I wonder whether there are some game forms that you could play with, and probably already do, so forgive me if I'm very much teaching my volleyball grandfather to suck eggs here. But you know, in my head I'm thinking, because I have similar challenges, funnily enough, around, you know, like, how do you get kids to have enough, like, you know, goes at, in my world of field hockey, you know, striking, hitting the object? Because in a kind of standard small-sided game, 3v3, 4v4, usually in a relatively small area, the requirement to actually hit the ball is pretty minimal, and the time to hit the ball, take the stick away from the ball, hit it, pretty minimal. So you don't see the action emerge an awful lot. So you have to design game forms that solicit that action particularly, and therefore the individual performing the action gets a lot of goes of the action to become increasingly proficient at it. And the then the other person who's engaged, or people engaged in that game, also get a lot of goes of whatever it might be that they have to do on the receiving end. And usually in my case, it's stopping the projectile that has been propelled towards them at rapid speed, and then doing something with it. So in this case, it feels to me like there's a game form in my mind around that is very focused on purely on serve, and I was thinking in my head around the idea of either, and there's a whole array of game forms in my mind, right? But like, so there might be like a service game, whereby, you know, the task is to land the ball in a particular spot or a particular zone, and the receiver has to move between either zone, kind of, and based on, so for example, if let's say there's two zones that the ball could possibly land in from the server, and the receiver stands in the middle, and kind of the serve is served, and if it lands successfully in either one of those zones without the receiver getting a hand on it and then making the ball go back up in the air like it could have then been passed to somebody, that's a point to the server. And they play that game head to head, having like 5 goes each, 5 goes each, 5 goes each. So, and that's just really getting them to the idea of, oh, the ball's gone right, the ball's gone left. And what, and then beginning just to, I guess, just perceptually attune to what somebody does to make the ball go right or the ball go left, or the ball to dip or the ball not to dip or whatever. And you'd have to design a different form around dipping and, backspin and all those sorts of things. Now, I imagine you've designed all those before, but those kind of game forms just came into my mind to say, that might be like a 1v1 game. Yeah. And obviously you've got spatial constraints in terms of the size of the gym and everything else. You might have to do that outside, I don't know. But it just felt to me like, is that something that's feasible to be done?
I think so. We do similar games. I think one of the issues, I don't know if issues is the right word, but one of the constraints that we find ourselves under is kind of like ensuring that everything we do in our gym follows our coaching philosophy. And one of our big philosophical ideas is that everything is linked. And so when so I'll go back maybe 15 years to when I was a completely different type of coach, and was much more the kind of coach that you tend to rail against on Twitter and everywhere else.
No, they find me. They seek me out and just try and just bait me.
Yeah. Well, I probably would have been one of those coaches, say 15 years ago. And, I would have completely, big change. But if I go back to then, and I would have looked at and said, when a player is passing a volleyball, receiving serve, that there was a way to specifically rate that serve or that reception in isolation. To say, okay, that was the typical volleyball approach is to rate it on a scale of 0 to 4, or 0 to 3, or 1 to 4, depending on what gym you're in. But so, that was a 4-point pass, meaning like a perfect pass. And now in our gym, we rate the pass off of the kill, off of the swing. There's a pass, there's a set, and there's a swing. And we, when a player will ask me, like, how good was my pass? And I'm like, well, what happened at the end? They're all linked. You can't separate them. And the players want to separate them, but we really push very hard to help them to encourage them to understand that our game is a game of relationships, not a game of isolated touches on the ball. And so
the only challenge I'd have on that is that sometimes I 100% agree with the philosophical position. But the problem then is that sometimes the sacrifice you have to make in order to maintain the kind of game fidelity, let's call it, is a reduction in the required number of repetitions to create those visual associations and the visual attunement or the perceptual attunement that you're looking for. So this is the balancing act we're always playing, is when we talk about representative task design, is this idea of how representative is representative enough. You don't want to get too reduced, and therefore you lose the game fidelity or the action fidelity. But at the same time, sometimes you have to do that a little bit without ever going fully to isolation. But you have to do some of that a little bit in order to create the conditions where the individual can have enough goes. But more importantly, sometimes you also need to reduce the elements of variability, because otherwise there is so much variability that, again, the awareness and the attentional focus on the action that's taking place, they can't attend to it because they're attending to so many other variables.
Yeah.
So I guess that's, and I totally hear where you're coming from, and it's a real tension that I wrestle with all the time. And I come away from sessions sometimes so frustrated because I'm like, I don't know whether I should have reduced there more, just simplified more in order to get where we were trying to get towards, or should I have stayed where I was and used a different constraint to draw attention to that? And that's one of the things I find myself sort of constantly reflecting on.
Yeah, I think that's almost an impossible task. It's a very, very difficult task to get right every time, because especially if you're dealing with children, younger people, there's going to be such a range of pace of development that some people will be at the point where you can take constraints away and give more variables and more options and more inputs to them, and they can cope with it and adapt to it. And other ones who are at the far away at the other end of the scale, and you need to reduce it more. So it's, if you're dealing with a larger group of people, that becomes increasingly difficult as the range of development increases. Yeah. So yeah, Stu, you've made a very difficult task for yourself there to walk away saying, yeah, I did that perfect that time, every time.
Oh no, and I'm reconciled to the fact that I'll always have that sense, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of people struggle with this as an approach, because you kind of never quite feel like you've got it right. I used to think there was a sweet spot, right? And I'd know it and I'd feel it and it'd be, oh yes, I'm in the sweet spot.
Yeah.
But I've come to understand now that the sweet spot is always just out of reach. Which is like, it's like
Yeah, I mean, it's that idea where I used to strive constantly as a coach to feel like that was a good practice, and my distinction of what made a good practice was more about like what I saw, like were they passing well, were they serving well, were they hitting well by the end of practice, and if that was the case, then that was a good practice. Whereas now, if I walk away from a practice questioning what we were doing and how effective it was, that's probably more my definition of a good practice. So like, am I asking myself questions about what we did? If I am, the players probably are too. And if they're asking questions of themselves and their teammates, then that's probably a really great practice. If they walk away from it feeling like, oh, we don't have any issues, we're right on point, we know exactly what we need to do, then that probably really wasn't a great practice.
I think that I also like what you said there, Stu, about how that it's just out of reach. There's something very nice about that space where players in front of you, there is almost that feeling of you seeing them getting it in one sense momentarily, and then they want to move on to the next thing. So it's always out of reach for them too, because if it's done the right way, they always have an appreciation themselves of, well, it can always be better. We could always just have been that little bit slicker or more efficient in our movement, or so on and so forth. And I think, like you said, it is that out of reach, but it is always, I think it's nice when you see that in players too. Even something I've done recently with under 11s, in little 3v3s. We start with kind of 1v1s, we go to 2v1s, 2v2s, and they're always moving into different opposition and all that kind of stuff. And yet the players themselves they're never looking to get it exactly right. They're just looking to just keep getting it better, which then means even more so, as one of the dads said to me the other evening, it was like, when this worked the way we would hope it, we have even less coaching for us to do, because they very much coach within that scenario themselves, which means that you can never reach it, because there's always there's so many variations of it. And I just think, as you were saying there, that idea for a coach is a great thing, but it's just as rewarding, I think, for the players now, depending on their ages and the different range of players and so on and so forth. They may not quite be able to articulate that feeling, but they do know that there's something nice going on, though, you know?
Right.
I wonder if that ties into the approach that coaches and players have. That constant development idea is not something that everybody necessarily subscribes to, right? I mean, I don't want to go down the growth mindset road too much, but I do know that there are different ways of thinking, right? Different philosophies people have, and so if you're of the mind that, you know, it's not necessarily about those constant little improvements that you're trying to make, whether that's as a coach or as a player, you just need to go in and do more, you know, work a bit harder, do a bit more, make the most of what you've got. Then that's a different frame of mind from saying, oh, I can keep pushing against, you know, get myself out of my comfort zone, keep pushing against what I know I can do, and keep making those incremental improvements. So I'm wondering, if we go back to the original question, maybe we can say that the ones who get it a bit more quickly are maybe the ones who are looking for it more, whereas the ones who don't get it quite so quickly, even when you present it to them, they're not really looking for it as much because they feel like, oh, it's just like something, I just can't do it. So, you know, I'll just have to work with what I've got and hope that I don't come across someone who completely does me.
So what you're saying then is that the variables that might be differentiating between the players that I'm seeing adapt and learn this concept and the ones that aren't, those variables that differentiate between those two groups are quite possibly outside of my control. And so my question's kind of mute.
I mean, there's so much that's out of our control as a coach. You just have to accept that, don't you? I mean, whether that particular thesis I've just presented is true or not, there are 100 things which are out of our control. So, you know, I feel like you just have to accept that and get on with what you can do.
Which is actually an important point, right? Because that's actually a central thesis of the ecological approach. So a traditional approach to coaching would have said, right, everyone's the same. I'm going to teach everybody in the same way by giving them technical solutions to replicate and copy. And some of those people will be able to, some of those people will then be, and then the idea is then those are then applied into some sort of game-like context. And the ones that can survive enough to be able to make the leap between what they've learned in isolation to what they learn then in the game context are the ones that then make some sort of progression. Whereas for me, what an ecological space does is it's basically saying we're going to design an environment that enables a range of different individuals to tap into the various perceptual variables and utilize those various perceptual variables in a way that helps them adapt to perform the task that's in front of them. And they will all come up with a range of different solutions to that. Some will be more or less effective. Some will have, over a period of time, need some guidance as to, like, getting, you know, moving beyond one that was that wasn't helping them. And some will, over a period of time, be able to do that themselves. Some of them will, you know, entirely self-direct or self-organize. But it's allowing through those range of information sources to come through. Now, the problem we have often is the nature of the game is such that there are times in which where if you keep that, I love this analogy, I got it from Keith, and I got it at your conference, Ed. If you keep the field of affordances open, right? So I think of it like in the north of England, you often have these fields with dry stone walls to separate where the sheep eat. And you open the gate of one, and you move the sheep into one area, and then they eat all the grass in that area, and then you open a gate of another, and they eat all the grass in another area, and by the time they've come back round to the original field, the grass has grown again, and they can start eating all the grass in that field as well. Now, you can either have all the gates open, where all of the possible fields of opportunity, fields of affordances are open all the time, and kind of hope that the athletes will, kind of go into the field that they need to be in order to solve the problem that the game is presenting, right? Yeah. But they don't always. And so sometimes you have to close the gates for them. And I think of constraints as a means to do so. So I'll use constraints as a means to say, I tell you what, go have a look around in this field over here. Now, when they get into that field, there's no instruction manual. There's just a field, but that field is a lot smaller than all the other fields. And in that field, there is a task or something like that that requires them to consider the responses that they might need to take. And because all the other fields are closed and they've just got this one, you as a coach and them as an athlete can attend to the action in a very different and more focused way. Mm-hmm. Now, that's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is what the guys in the Magic Academy call the game within the game, where they would use, for example, a task or a rule-based constraint as a means by which to draw an athlete's attention to a particular action. So let's say we keep all the fields open, and you can go to any one of these fields, but very quickly, because of the nature of the game, you realize that it's that field I need to be in order to be successful in this game. And so you start to ignore the other perceptual variables and you only focus on those ones. So an example would be, I guess in a volleyball, if you wanted people to really attune to service and what's happening with the server, you could, for example, say, in this game, we're going to get 10 points for an ace. Whoa. We've really got to make sure we get this service up, right? It's almost like anything to do to get that. So we're going to maybe tune into that. Or, I'm starting to speculate because I don't know your sport well enough, but it may be that, for example, if the server can successfully use a disguise of some kind, right, and therefore win the point using some kind of service variable, so it's a challenge for them, challenge for the server, use a different service that they would otherwise use, or use a disguised serve of some kind. I'm doing the action, look like I'm an expert, and the receivers, kind of have to do what they need to do to stop them getting the 10 points. Now, in that context, what we're doing is it's still a game. You've still got all the possible action variables, but the thing to attend to is the server, because that's where you're going to get most of your points. So attention gets drawn there, and that's the other way of doing it. And I don't know if I think I've played with both, and I don't know if I've got a right answer or a wrong answer. But by doing both in my sessions and using Ed's analogy of maintaining task consolidation, it may be you do both in a session. So you do one where we're only in this field, one where all the fields are open but the game form is there. It's essentially the same task. There's just different levels of variability, and then you can begin to see how the players are responding to those sorts of things. I guess that's just an idea that's floating around in my mind. How does that sound?
I like that. I like the field analogy a lot. I actually think I'm going to write that down and steal it. I think that's a really great one to put in front of my coaches to help them understand this idea of the affordances and getting people to attend to things. I think there's two questions or just thoughts I had on that idea. One being, you don't have to do one or the other of the two things you just said. You can actually combine them in the same game.
Yeah.
I mean, if you take serving specifically, like say you did the thing where you said, hey, if the server gets an ace, they're going to get 10 points. So now the receivers are focusing in more on the server because they want to be able to stop them. But now that I've got them focusing on the server, there's actually specific areas of the server that is best to focus in on. So just looking at the server as an entire body is probably not going to be as helpful as looking at the server's shoulder and elbow. Yeah. So now that we've got them in the right geographical location of Northern England, let's get them to pick a specific field in that geographical location to attend to.
That's a nice extension of the analogy. I like that.
I can see something happening here someday when someone meets Keith Davids and says, I have a great analogy for this, Keith. Like, what? That's mine. No. I heard this from
It's all about a town called Halifax.
The other thing I wanted to make on the analogy is we get kids who like to jump the walls.
Yeah.
Great.
And those kids tend to be the better kids, which in a traditional model of coaching, those kids are seen as the trouble kids.
Yeah.
The ones who don't play by the rules, who jump the walls and go to try to find things somewhere else. But those are the kids that we want. We want to encourage that. We want them to find ways to adapt to the game that might be outside of what our expectations of the game were. And so the kids, this happens. We just got, what are they called? From the coaching lab, we got those cards that he's making. And they're not, there's, like 60 in a deck, and I had to like take out about 40 of them that were very soccer specific. Yep, there they are. So I just got these, and I was really enamored by the idea. I thought it was a great idea. So I went through and found the ones that we could apply to our sport, and using them in our gym. And what the interesting thing is we actually do have players who are, looking at a card, reading it, and then interpreting it in a way that is so far away from what I would have thought the interpretation.
Wow. And
then applying it in a way that is, in using that analogy, it's 7 fields over. But it's, and I had a coach last week who stepped in to say, no, this is what that card means. And I was like, and so then I pulled the coach aside afterwards, and I was like, why don't we just let them run with what they think instead of what we think? Because it's there, so we now have like a coaching rule that it's like, once they've drawn that card, or any rule that we create, because we do similar things to what the cards do just on our own as well, just let the kids interpret it and run with it as they want. And maybe we're not going to get the result that we wanted. Maybe they're not going to attend to the specific thing that we were hoping that they would attend to, but they're still getting something out of it, and possibly more, because it was their choice instead of ours.
On all of what we've just spoken about there's a couple of points that have reminded me. The idea of the coaches feeling that to exert some form of control over the session is something that I'm reminded of something Mark O'Sullivan said recently, where he was talking about when they're engaging with the adult, the parents as coaches, and trying to get them to be more engaged and not just stand outside the field and to actually come in and be part of the session. So he's observed that a lot of the coaches who don't have a sporting background are way more accessible and open to the idea of an ecological kind of approach, constraint-set approach, because they're not coming with their predetermined ideas about how they were coached, which tends to be, if you were growing up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 90s, and even some today still, depending on where you are, a very coach-led experience. But he was saying it's incredible. Those parents who are new to coaching and not with a deep sporting background and come from other backgrounds, other type of childhoods, music and so on and so forth, have a much greater likelihood of just letting go and not trying to control everything in the session and not have such high expectation that everything's got to work so well. And what it has reminded me of and encouraged me to do in sessions, a bit like you said, those kids who want to jump over the wall. And because I kind of have one of those kids myself, he will be a wall jumper. And what it is really nice now to see is, and just, every so often when a kid literally goes postal in a session, that becomes the session. And when I've done that, and when I've encouraged other coaches to say, hey, go with that. Let's just see where that might take them. And they're like, really? But that's not what we were going to do. Yeah, but you know what? It might actually be better than what we were going to do. And it's going to be at his level, and all his peers are at his level. So maybe we got it wrong, kind of thing. It's 9 times out of 10, not all the time, but 9 times out of 10, it just takes it into a place that I could never have taken it. And it is that idea. And it has begun to happen in a couple of coach education sessions that I've been doing is what's happened is afterwards, coaches or parents have said, you know, that's the first time that kid has ever spoken up in a session. And it might have been because one of the wall jumpers, as you would call them, was about to do something, and we went with that, and all of a sudden the kids then feel, oh, so we're actually allowed to do this. And all of a sudden the kid it might be that day that kid thinks, wow, well, gee, Brian, my friend, we went and did his idea. I've had an idea for weeks, but I didn't think I could say something about it. And those moments are just, they're heaven, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Because the wall jumpers are always kind of going to do it, but when you get someone else in the group that isn't maybe a wall jumper, but all of a sudden has the potential to be a wall jumper, that's class. And that would have only, I think, come from them being, you know, that kind of led by their own peers as opposed to led by someone that they find it maybe more difficult to relate to, you know, 45-year-old gray-haired who's kind of slowly saying, yeah, just go and do I can't keep up with you. You go and do that. It's kind of cool. But again, it comes back to that idea of letting go. And I know sometimes people who are resistant to this way will interpret that as, oh, so you're saying so we don't coach. There's no need to coach. So this hands-off coaching, just let them figure out whatever way. You're like, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. You know, if that was, it's just about being more conscious, more aware, more attuned to the session that's unfolded in front of you to know when you need to engage or not, as the case may be.
And sometimes for me, one of the things I think about that is I have to say that's probably because I'm a product of my education and a product of my kind of early experiences, that's one of the habits I find hardest to break, which is when I have a particular idea of a place we might want to get to. And when I have that idea, that's when I find myself kind of closing down possibilities. A really good example of that recently, I just devised this little warm-up activity, and I did it for my under-8s group recently, and we called it, I doing a lot of stuff with video games, so I created Hockey Mario Kart, and we created a little track. And for the under-8s, you know, I just want them to do lots and lots of ball manipulation and get them an opportunity to just, like, you know, carry the ball. So we created a track and we created some obstacles. Some were static obstacles and some were moving obstacles and some were human obstacles. I had some tires and we were rolling tires backwards and forward across the track, and they were having to dodge the tires. And then, you know, the big bad like baddie would come along in the shape of me, and, you know, and I would be like trying to get them, even though I wasn't really trying to get them, but I was sort of getting them, and they're all running away chasing, and they're having these races, and like some of the games were like they were racing together and they're sort of crashing off, and they have to do a spin, like 5 spins like in Mario Kart if they fall off the track, and then they keep going round. And then we did a relay race, and then we did like a head-to-head race where, like, you know, the kind of the fastest 2 went off against each other, and then the next fastest, so they have a little race against each other. You know, we did loads of different formats. It was really great and it was really good fun, and we had a good time doing it. And then I did it with my older group, the under 12s group, and a couple of the kids said, "We'll design the track," and I went, "Okay, okay, right then, yeah." And they designed this track, and it was like, that's rubbish. You'll be able to follow it. And it's too small, and everyone's going to crash. And so I went, no, we'll have to do it over here. And afterwards I was like, why didn't I just let them go on their track? They probably would have adjusted it, and it would have had a bit of fun while they were doing it. It wasn't a big deal.
Yeah.
But I had this idea of the goalkeepers being like the baddies, and they have to, like, dodge the goalkeepers. And because they needed a certain amount of space to do so, they needed a track with a certain size, and therefore the goalkeepers had that. And so, you know, I had a picture in my head of what it looked like, and then they come along with their idea, and I'm not letting them go with their idea because it was not quite where my picture was. So that was annoying. I was annoyed at myself, and they were annoyed at me for not letting them do it, and everyone was just a bit annoyed.
Yeah. Been there, done that, wore the t-shirt, made hundreds of t-shirts, sold them at a Saturday market. Amazing.
Yep. There was a video made by one of the U.S. He's a professional beach player. Him and his brother are making some videos that are, you know, intended for just to kind of share their story of growth and where they're going with the sport. And his most recent one, it's been interesting watching their progression as they've started making these videos from a traditional model of, you know, perfect technique and all this stuff, and now they're moving very much into something that sounds a lot like ecological dynamics. And it's been a really interesting thing to watch this. But his latest video, he was basically talking about creativity, and he you know, quoted Ken Robinson, and I was trying to find the quote and I can't find it, but because I didn't want to misquote it, but it's the one that is specifically about like conformity, and that you know, our system of education, our system of, and you know, extrapolate that to coaching, is very much a system that's typically built on getting kids to conform to what we want them to do. And if we build a system on conformity, we shouldn't be surprised when we don't have creative kids. That creativity is the one thing that allows them to actually, every celebrated athlete in the world is celebrated because of their creativity, and in any sport. And so to get an athlete to be creative, we have to give them the opportunity to be creative, which means that we got to let them jump. But if we're always getting them to conform to our idea, then they're never going to be creative. Or if they try to be creative, they find that they're getting punished for it in some way or form. And so if they're going to be creative, they have to hide it from the adults in the room. And I, you know, that's something that we've seen, you know. I guess that relates to another thought I had, is when you were talking about attunement, is the thing that has really been fascinating me a lot in the gym is getting myself and my coaches to attune to the right things as much as we're trying to get our players to attune to the right things. And, you know, and being willing to, you know, what decisions are we going to make as coaches based on the information that we're getting? And a quick example of this is we created a new program this year. I tried to be really clear about what the program was by naming it Play. It's just called Play. We wanted to be very clear with the people who signed up for it that what they were going to get when they walked in the door was a 1-hour opportunity to play volleyball, and that there was going to be minimal coaching. There definitely are coaches there. We're overseeing it. We're challenging the kids. We gave them basic ideas, but 99% of their time in that program is just play volleyball. 2s, 3s, 4s, 6s. And one day, due to school holidays and things like that, we had a lot less show up than normal. And so we didn't really know what to do with them. Like, we didn't know how to organize them because we had so many less, and we didn't really know what was going to happen until, you know, we normally have 60 and we had like 22 show up, and we didn't really know that was going to happen. And so I was a little thrown off and like, oh gosh, what are we going to do today? So I just asked them, I'm like, what do you guys want to do? Why don't you go figure out what you want to do and go do it? And one of the courts decided they wanted to play 6s, and I'm looking over at them, and it was a completely lopsided teams. You know, one group it was just very clear from my perspective that it wasn't going to be fun, that it was going to be, this one team was going to completely destroy the other team. And you know, my first reaction was, I'm going to go over there and suggest they change it. But then I was like, nope. I think one of the other reasons why I named the program Play was to remind myself of what I wanted to allow the kids to do. So I said, nope, I'm going to just let them play. and then see what happens. And so they played a game, and it was, volleyball is we played a 25, and I think it was 25-1. And I was going to go, my intention was to go over when the game was done, and through asking some questions, get them to talk about that experience and maybe what could they do to have a better experience in the next game. I got caught up on one of the other courts helping some kids who had asked for some ideas for some added rules that they could challenge themselves with, and I didn't get a chance to go over. And so when I'm done at the other court, I look over thinking, oh my gosh, they probably just started another game and it's going to be 25-1 again. I look over and they had redone all the teams, or they had redone both teams on their own. They had a talk. When I went over and asked them, they had a talk about the 25-1 game and how much they didn't enjoy that at all because nobody really got to play, and it was just like one girl serving the whole time. They did everything that I would have done as a coach on their own, and then the next game it was like 27-25 because you have to win by 2 in our sport, and the girls were excited. They were making, they were very loud and very they were communicating, and they were just having a great time and jumping up and down. And for context, it's like 7th grade girls. So for us, that's about, what is that, like 13, I guess, 13-year-olds. And so I'm just standing on the sideline, like my chin's almost on the ground, again, remembering that if we give them the opportunity to, I totally agree. It shouldn't happen all the time, but when we give them the opportunity to figure things out on their own in the right context, in a right environment, these kids can brilliantly solve these problems, and in a way probably better than I could have, because I would have walked over and been like, well, let's line up, and I'm going to go 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, and switch up into better teams, and that's random. I mean, there's a good chance it would have been terrible again. They actually talked amongst each player, and they decided who the best 6 were as a group. And said, okay, we're going to split you 6 up. We're going to put 3 of you on one team and 3 of you on the other. And I wouldn't have done that because I was afraid. I'd be afraid of offending these 13-year-old girls. But because they were able to have that conversation within their peer group, it was brilliant. It was very. It was just awesome. So,
do you think if you called the program drill, you would have intervened differently?
Yes.
I'd love to be able to go around with a post-it to programs like, yeah, you've misnamed your program. You need to call that drill. You need to call that Black and Decker. You need to call that. I love that.
I'm a big fan of words. I think words have a lot of power.
That's what I mean. It's brilliant.
Brilliant. When there was a lot of thought that went into naming it play, and ultimately it came down to one day not knowing what to call it, and I was just like, well, what are they going to do? And they're going to play, so let's call it play so that they know what they're going to do.
But I love the fact that it reminded you to.
Yeah, and that was an unintended consequence, but it's one of my favorite consequences, because every day,
brilliant,
with the coaches who were there, it became a joke actually at the beginning of every session. All of us coaches would be standing together talking about what was going to go on that day, and then we would just kind of look at each other and go, well, let's go let them play. Because there wasn't any other option. We didn't call it that. I do think though that if I would have called it drill, I would have gotten a phone call from Stuart.
Yeah.
I think there might have been like a.
You'd have had this knock on the door, Loren. You'd have opened the door. There would have been me like this, with a really grumpy face. What's going on, Loren?
I'm here to play volleyball. I hear you're short a setter.
There would have been a lightning strike in the background. There'd have been rain. There would have been a silhouette image.
Your cape blowing in the wind behind you.
Angrily brandishing a red cone.
Yes, exactly. That's another name we could have called it. We could have called it cones.
Cones. These are good names. We should paint.
Copyright it. Yeah.
Your point. One of your points about creativity. You made me think about. There's that great story that Ken Robinson tells about the little girl doing the drawing. and the teacher comes up and says, "What are you drawing?" And she says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher says, "But no one knows what God looks like." And she says, "They will in a minute."
Yep. You love that.
And that's a classic example, I think. And I love that story. I tell it all the time because I just think to myself, it's like, we're so quick. He says something like, you don't grow into creativity, you grow out of it. Because the rest of the world tells you that that you aren't creative, or you're not allowed to be creative, or creativity is bad and conformity is good. And most kids by 18, they start out at 6. You ask kids, handful of classroom of kids, and say, how many of you are creative, and all their hands go up. And by 18, it's like 4.
Yeah.
Because we're sort of told that it's like it's not a good thing. And something I thought about linked to this, and Ed, I'd be interested to get your views on this in terms of whether there's anything out there in the literature, or have I just coined a new thing? I doubt I have. But the very idea of constraint-led coaching, and I get the idea of constraint-led coaching, but there's something also a bit dark about it. And I wonder whether we'd be better off talking about affordance-led coaching, based on the principle of constraining to afford.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what I was talking earlier about the fields, Loren, is the idea of you can constrain in order to afford particular courses of action, or in order to afford information, to reduce the information. So I sometimes think of it as a lens as well. So yes. To get more focused, you might reduce what the other things that you're looking at, so that you get a very, very sharp image of the particular activity.
Yeah. And then decision making becomes easier within that too. I mean, I used to work in the restaurant industry, and I mean, there's a lot of research done in the restaurant industry that those places that have the huge menu that has thousands of options on it, people spend a lot more time at their table deciding what they want to eat, and are less happy with their choice in the long run than a place that might have 5 things on the menu. People are going to decide quicker, which in the restaurant industry, you want people to decide quicker, because then they leave quicker and you can get another table in quicker, so you make more money.
Yeah.
But they decide quicker, and they're happier with their choice. And so, because you've constrained their choice, like that's constraint-based restauranting, and so I think that the same thing, that's what you're talking about, I think, with players is in teams, is can we reduce the size of the menu that's available to the players?
Yeah, and to extend that analogy, if you go into a restaurant, I'm always wary if you go into a restaurant and you see lots and lots of choice, for me, I'm thinking that's a pretty overworked kitchen who are going to be pumping out fairly mass-produced stuff. Whereas if it's a much more reduced menu, then they're putting a bit more love and care into that.
Yep.
So from my perspective, with that kind of reduced down menu, what that does is it enables quality.
Yes.
And so for me, in terms of quality reps, if we're talking about in our landscape, by having that reduced menu of opportunity or menu of perceptual information, we can attend to that information with a far greater degree of depth and quality than we could in an environment that had a far greater choice of perceptual variables. Because then it can just be luck that the person happens to attune to the particular perceptual variable that makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I had never, until you were saying that, I hadn't really linked before in my mind that concept between the restaurant menu and then what we're doing on the court. But I think it works for me. I worked in the restaurant industry for almost 20 years, so it makes a lot of sense to frame it that way in my mind. But I do think you're absolutely right in that, when we can create an opportunity for a player or a team to reduce the information that they need, that they are looking at, or that's available to them, it allows them to get better at the thing that we're hoping that they'll get better at, without telling them that's the thing we want you to get better at. So that ultimately, kind of, I think, is the concept that I was looking for in my original question, is how best do we go about doing this? Could be in formulating games, the environment, or on an individual basis, player by player, ways to reduce the options of things for them to look at, so that they will then more often be more likely to choose the things we're hoping they'll look at, so that they're learning better. But then still allowing them some choice to allow for the individuality of each individual player.
I had another thought earlier on, because I think that's a nice kind of point of kind of not quite conclusion, but certainly a nice way of rounding off. But something else that occurred to me, which might take us off down a different avenue, was when you were describing earlier, Loren, about there are certain players that kind of get it, and those players, it makes, it really connects with them, and then all of a sudden, they can progress and others don't. One of the things that I've wondered about a more, a kind of an ecological construct around human development is something that Ross Tucker, he's a sports scientist based out in South Africa, and he's written extensively about talent development, got a few really nice YouTube things on there. He actually equates talent development to economics, and it made me think about this, which is, do you want lots of quite good players, or do you want a few absolute world beaters? Now, I'm not saying that the ecological approach necessarily lends itself to one or the other, but I sometimes wonder if, as a consequence of what you might call a less intrusive approach to learning in sport, i.e., not technique led, if that means that it may be that it's not all of the players can develop at the same speed, which is that very Taylorist approach to education. Everybody, it's the tide that raises all boats, right? Actually, what happens is that some progress and others maybe don't progress as far, right? Or I don't know this for sure. But if the trade-off is world beaters, proper, nobody can touch us world beaters, is that something that is an attractive proposition to us? And I don't know, you can tell I'm thinking out loud, but there's a part of me just wondering what is our goal? Is our goal to have everybody everyone to be quite good? Or is our goal to allow everybody to develop at their own space, in their own rate, and for a few of those individuals to connect the dots together within an environment that allows them to really flourish and thrive, and they go on to be way better than they could have otherwise been in a more mechanistic approach to development? I don't know.
That's a good question, because I think a lot of that, one of the biggest ways to answer that question is you first have to, define what your program or your team or your coaching philosophy is. What are you doing? Like for me in our program, we work with 6 through 18-year-olds, and our goal has never been about, like, our number one goal has nothing to do with volleyball. Volleyball for us is a medium through which we are allowing our players to explore who they are as people. And so, within that answer would then have me answer the question you just asked much differently than a volleyball club that might be saying, we are wanting to compete at USA Volleyball National Championships. We want to make D1 volleyball players. That if the club has that goal versus a club that has our goal, that you're going to answer that question very differently, I think. Would I love to have some world leaders come out of our gym? Would I love to see players from our gym move on to D1 and have opportunities to play? Absolutely. Is that our focus? No, because we made a decision 6 years ago that if we only focus on that, then we're only focused on like 2% of the people that come into our gym. And so what is the other 98% doing besides paying away for the 2%? To me, what we're doing is more of a community thing than it is we still wanted to develop talent. We still want these players to reach their ultimate ability, but I don't want that to be at the cost of reaching their ultimate ability as a human being, as a person first.
So performance is a byproduct of an enriched development experience.
Yes.
in your construct.
Yes.
Yeah, that kind of works for me.
Well, me too. That's like when I hear that, and that's wonderful, like genuinely wonderful. What I struggle with, and it is a very, I get how ignorant this is going to sound, and I don't know, arrogant or whatever. Maybe I don't even have the right word. But when I hear that, I cannot get my head around why anyone would have any other way, any other construct for their club, especially when you, as you say there, and I think you were being generous with 2%. The facts would say it's even lower than that we want to become world class. And it just beggars belief how other philosophies and constructs are surviving or even thriving in the industry. It also speaks to that overarching philosophy and debate around early specialization versus diversification, because I think if kids that are coming to your gym, Loren, are coming there because it's a place where they really feel that they are welcomed, they really feel that they are listened to, they are part of something, and they genuinely feel that they're not just fodder for the best, but they also might swim, and they might play softball, and they might play, I still come back to that idea of those kids who diversify. They will always remember that club where they were made to feel a part of something, as opposed to the club where they feel like they were a part of conveyor belt and they were just set on the slower one because there was the much faster conveyor belt. And I struggle. I constantly struggle. And look, Stu, I don't have as much time in that development space nowadays. But when I'm there, I struggle so hard, and I just find it really difficult to articulate it in a way that brings people along. Sometimes I find myself sometimes being quite the thorn in the ointment, and I know it doesn't work that way because but it wells up almost inside me, that idea of how are we still thinking this way, working this way.
I see it as an adaptation to socio-cultural and environmental constraints. So it's no surprise to me that Manchester City has a picture of its under-5s team, quite proudly there, all these kids in kits lined up, arms folded, coaches next to them. Look at us, look at our under-5s team. It's no surprise to me at all, because if you think about what our society values, and if you think about what and if you think about the way in which, competition for young people is deemed to be, valuable, or deemed to be an important thing, kind of adult created competition. If you think about that, then it lends itself to this kind of activity, because it all becomes about that. And I've worked in sports, traditional British sports particularly, whereby you make a change, you go against that, you swim against that tide, right? So you even bring about, as a governing body, you bring about legislation or regulation that says, right, we're not doing this anymore, right? We're not going to have like formal competitions with cups and shields and all that sort of stuff for 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds. We're not even going to start any of that until they're well into secondary school, 12 or 13. and see what you get, right? When your media is forcing your chief executive onto the breakfast TV shows and into the papers and hauling them over the coals because this is the reason we're never going to win a World Cup because we've gone soft and all these sorts of things, and the debate becomes about that. And so you end up in this situation where increasingly everything we see is becoming increasingly polarized, and people who genuinely, passionately believe in the sports experience being about something other than an outcome are becoming an increasingly marginalized group of fanatics. It's bizarre, but it's a response to socio-economic environmental constraints, in my view.
I agree, because I think from my thought on it is that we equate competition at the youth levels to a competition as an adult. We see them as equal. We see them as, if you want to know how to compete as an adult, you have to compete as a child.
Yeah.
And I believe, much like a cheetah or a puppy, a dog, that if you want to know how to compete as an adult, you play as a child.
Yep.
And that if we, I just heard a story about how the difference between the way that the Thai kickboxers train when they're young versus like a United States kickboxers train when they're young. And that U.S. kickboxers, when they're training when they're young, they can't have very long training sessions because when they get in the ring to train, they just want to win. And so they compete in every session, and so it turns into a bout, and they can't train for very long. Whereas the Thai kickboxers, they just play. They slap and soft kick, and they'll go for hours. And that story made me think of the book by James Carse, The Finite and Infinite Games, which is something that I think relates to your point about all of this, is that we as a society, I guess, I don't know if that's a apt overarching declaration, but we are addicted to finite games. We're addicted to things that have ends, and that in the end, if the person I know or the person I'm associated with or I feel affiliated with ends the game on top, then I'm happier. If it's my kid, if it's my team, if it's my country, if it's my whatever. And I think we've lost the appreciation for the infinite game, the games that never end, which is what youth development is. Youth development, whether it be sport development or just youth development as a human being, is an infinite game. It never ends. And the finite game of volleyball, in my case, is just a piece of that infinite game. And when you put the finite game as more important in the moment than the infinite game, is when you run into problems. And I think that's where we see where society is right now, with youth sports at least, because that's the space I'm in, is that the finite game has become more important than the infinite game. And if we can flip that and make that infinite game, the game that never ends, the game that everybody wants to continue, understands the need for it to continue, where, to reference your earlier point, the game where the end is always just out of reach.
Yeah.
Right? If we can get people to embrace how fun and enjoyable those games are, then I think we make a dent in what's happening. But unfortunately, people, again, a very broad term, but people have a tendency to only embrace things that they can measure. And because finite games are very easy to measure, that's what people put precedence on, is the end of a game. And when you play a finite game, it's all about who's going to end the game on top, and that's what our entire society is kind of based on. And so I think that really influences youth development and youth sports, making youth sports about emulating adult competition in sports. And kids are not adults. I think I read that on Twitter a few times,
Kids are not mini adults.
Yes, kids are not mini adults. I think I've seen a few tweets that might have said that hundreds of times in the same tweet. But I think that's just to me, that's where the huge distinction is. And if we can get people to put the importance of the development of the lifelong development of this human being in front of me as the most important thing that we're doing, then it changes the perspective of what we're doing.
I got a document sent to me today. It's the FAI, the Football Association of Ireland. It's the Player Development Plan. It's a 12-page document for how to engage under sixes and under sevens. And when I say this is one of the most frightening documents I think I've ever had come across my email box, I'm not understating that. And it is what you're talking about, Loren. And this is an official document with Rude Doctor on the front page. He's the high performance director for the Football Association of Ireland, and he systematically goes through, and they have lovely words in here like player centered, this, and it's lovely. It draws you in to make you feel like, maybe they're beginning to think a little way about this. And then it comes to a table that I'm looking at here, which systemizes the development for the kids. And it goes through at the age group they're in, what the squad size should be, what the team size should be, the match format, what the match duration should be, the referee or no referee, the playing time, what percentage you play and not, and drills, the league tables or not, the pitch size, the goal size, the ball size and weight. And it's literally this perfectly linear program for development. And it will fail. Of course it will, because they're dealing with humans. I think someone there in that organization thinks they're in a movie with Will Smith, like iRobot or something, and I think they thought at the end of that movie the robots took over or something. And yet clubs all over our country are being sent this document. If you're with the under sevens, this is what you should be doing. Start preparing them for this. Not, well, look at your kids. What standard are your kids at? Maybe soccer is only a small part of the sports they play. Maybe it's the main part for some. Maybe none of that in here, anywhere at all in that, in fact. And this is from a national governing body in one of the if not the most popular sport, it certainly will fluctuate between this and 1A another all the time. Soccer it's a global sport, and no more so than in Ireland here. And this is a country now, I need to remind you if you don't know already, that has for the first time brought the age level down for national league. So now there's an under 13s national league program, which has had already a catastrophic impact on the clubs, because now larger clubs are poaching kids at 11 and 12 to be able to compete with their team for the under 13 league. And yet it's, we are going headlong down this pathway, even though there's people like Laura Finnegan, a lecturer in Waterford Institute of Technology, whose PhD, her own research and her ongoing research screams, let's go in the other direction, please, pleading with the national governing body to go in the other direction. No, we're going this direction, because our head guy, he's Dutch. And if you're from Dutch, you must have known Johan Cruyff at some point. So if you knew Cruyff, you must be an amazing footballer. So you must know more football than the Irish. It's as simple, it is as blatant almost as that. That God forbid that there be someone in this country who might actually have a broader sense of what football, soccer should have and how it should play a part in young people's lives. No, let's get another person in who's a football expert, transplant their expertise model on this little island on the edge of Europe, because, that's what it's all about. It's about producing world-class players. And as I said, this is this will bring a tear to a glass eye, this document. It's just frightening, the linear relationship that they are suggesting. Not, well, if you have a team that's not here, you don't have to go on this. Go at the pace that they're at, and so on and so forth. But again, it's like you're pushing against the tide when you talk about the Man City kind of pictures, and you talk about the ideas of, working towards medals and so on and so forth. And you're thinking, that's beautiful. That is, and you were saying, it would be wonderful, no doubt, for Rise Volleyball to be able to look ahead and be able to say, wow, do you remember that kid? She was in our program 15 years ago. She still plays, and she's a professional athlete. But also, look at all the other kids who were who were with us 15 years ago, and they still play. Not professional athletes, but they're still playing. And they're in their 20s now, they're in their 30s, and they're still playing.
Yeah.
We don't have that here. We're matching all the global dropout rates in Ireland, matching them, if not ahead of them. In fact, the recent European Health Report came out saying that Ireland by 2030 will be the fattest nation in Europe. 11 years from now. And we've only got, we're a small country. You can drive from tip to tip in about 5 hours and across it in about 3. And that's where we're heading. With the amount of sport that we do play as kids in primary school, our females, our girls fall off a cliff face in secondary school, and they're followed quickly by the boys by the end of secondary school, which is high school to you, Loren. And it's because we're getting these kind of documents, a 12-page document about how to devise a linear program for your 6-year-olds.
David, I think you're quite keen to come in on this, because I think the cricket experience might be going in a different direction, I think. Is that right or not?
Yeah, certainly in Scotland, although there are a lot of reflections. I mean, there is a big spreadsheet which defines, pitch sizes and type of ball and all that kind of thing. So I can see there's the link there. But I think with Scottish cricket, certainly, and I think English cricket is going in a similar way, there's a movement now towards, rather than saying at this age you must be doing this, they're moving it more towards levels. And you're saying, well, if you're at this level, then this is the type of game that we're talking about. And if you're at the next level, then this is the type of game that we're talking about. So that's certainly it's certainly more flexible. And in certain parts of Scotland, in the east of Scotland, the younger stuff, although they have fixtures, they don't publish a league table, so they don't up to under 12. They don't publish a league table, so they don't know. They don't know what happens. They might, they compete in a game, but they don't know what that means in the overall, context.
It's the same in England, Ed. And actually, I have to applaud the ECB for this. It's been a long time coming, but so I'm coming into our cricket season, and under 11s is the kind of first age at which you begin to play formalised games against other clubs, which I still think's a bit early, but anyway, that's by the by. And
they have this here about leagues and when they come in and out, and I get that. But what I like the difference between what you guys are saying is, all the work that Damien Farrow and his guys in Australia has done about scaling equipment and all that lovely research that
Ian
Renshaw is involved in, but Tim Buzzard and with Tennis Australia, that's all about suggesting about how to develop. It's not hard and fast rules.
Yeah.
It's about manipulating the space. It's about manipulating the equipment. It's about manipulating the rules and so on and so forth to enable development, but not hard and fast rules by, at this age, this is happening. And then we're all moving on to here. And then I love this section here. Under 12s, it's on a box to box pitch in 2 meters by 5 meter goals. And from under 13, forevermore, full pitch, full size goals.
Yeah, but so many sports are like that. I mean, so cricket's great. So under 11s, right, there's 3 formats you can play. Okay, there's 20 over, 11 aside, cricket, full cricket, which is you're out, that kind of thing. Then there's another one which is an 8-a-side pairs game, right? You go in as a pair, you bat for 4 overs, you get 24 balls each. If you get out, you lose 5 points, but you just get as many goes as you want. brilliant for the ones who aren't quite ready for the thing. And they're both played with a hard ball, smaller size hard ball. And then there's another format now, which is an 8-a-side softball game, right? So those kids who've just come up now, maybe not been playing cricket that long. Wow, a hard ball, really? Pads, all that? Oh, no, thank you very much. Play it with a softball, right? Oh, okay, great. That's a bit more realistic. So we've got a bit of flex, right? Different levels of ability. There you go. That's it. The beautiful incredible. That's the one you want. Hockey, on the other hand, this isn't mandated, but 8-year-olds, under 8, right? They play like on a quarter pitch, full across the pitch, still pretty big. Then at next stage up, under 10, they play on a half pitch across the pitch. Under 12s, they do that. At under 14s, full pitch. 13-year-olds, they're tiny, full pitch, 11 aside, never touch the ball. And we wonder why these players don't develop. It's like bizarre. It's really crazy. But these game forms are like that everywhere. And I don't know. I take your point, though. I think the point of linearity is seductive. It makes sense, doesn't it? It makes intuitive sense.
Incredibly seductive. And if you are coming from this, not from a coaching science background or a background in sports science or an coach education, it's giving you a platform. It's giving you a system. It's almost your handbook to follow. But then you're just not looking at the kids anymore. You're just looking at your handbook. Okay, we're moving on to page 3 this week, guys. Okay, page 3, let's go.
Yeah.
Looking to see are they even off page 1 yet.
Yeah. It's fascinating, though. I have to say I've been responsible for producing some of those frameworks in the past. So I sort of look back shamefaced, going, "Oh God, really?" But interestingly, I think that one of the things about this whole space, if you like, is where this conversation started was us applauding and celebrating Loren's commitment to player development and actually having the bravery and the to rail against the machine and to say we're about the young person and the things they like. Now, going back to my original hypothesis around this whole idea around, what if one doesn't. So for me, I think it's a worthwhile trade-off, right? If for example, we don't necessarily, let's say, get quite as many, good players. They don't quite go, but we produce the odd world beater. But the trade-off is, of the ones that are all involved, more of them continue to participate. I'll take that every time.
Yes.
And if I had to trade off the work producing of the world beaters, I'd still take it every time.
Yes. I would agree 100% with that.
I agree.
Because I think one of the processes that happens in an environment like ours, and I'm sure in the environments that you are creating for your athletes as well, is that the things that they learn only within the silo of that sport. They are things that they can learn that apply to the rest of their lives. So we talk a lot in our gym about the process of learning and what does that encompass. David mentioned the growth mindset earlier. I know that's a rough topic to go into sometimes, but we talk about that a lot in our gym. And so if we produce a couple kids who go on to play at the highest level of our sport, but yet all of the lessons, I guess, all of the explorations that we've gone into in our gym are of value to all of the players for the rest of their lives. I mean, I had a player call me up, an ex-player call me up, 5 years after she left our program, to tell me about something she learned in our gym that she was applying in her job after she had graduated college, and how she finally understood the application of it. And that was way more like uplifting for me than anything she could have told me about the sport of volleyball. That to me that's being a successful coach. And so I think that, that's to your point. Yes. Is it great that a player may go on and become this amazing player that we can point to and say, she came through our program. Yes, but I mean, I have a girl right now who is being recruited. Well, she's not playing for us this year, but she played for us for 6 years. She's being recruited by Yale and Harvard as a rugby player. And that's more exciting to me than if she would have told me they were recruiting her as a volleyball player.
But is she not your athlete, Loren? Is she not your athlete? Are you not disappointed that you're losing her sport? No?
No, not at all.
Really?
I love this idea. On a line out, she's jumping up there and spiking the ball back to the front hop. Look at those transferable skills.
Brilliant.
She's apparently a pretty awesome rugby player, and she's been battling choosing between the two for quite a few years. And this year she made the decision to just focus on rugby.
Wow.
And I asked her, why? And she's like, well, I've got places like Yale and Harvard talking to me about coming and playing there. And I was like, that's a really good reason. But it was funny because I actually had to have that conversation with myself. Like, had she told me Yale is wanting to recruit me as a volleyball player, and she did tell me Yale is looking to recruit me as a rugby player, which one am I more excited about? And for some reason, I'm more excited about the rugby. And I just think it's awesome. It's such a fascinating thing
Fascinating.
I think it's just, again, maybe it's that creativity piece where if you work at a building where you produce chocolate cupcakes, when chocolate cupcakes are sent out of the building, no one's surprised. But if you work at a company where you produce chocolate cupcakes and for some reason banana bread leaves the building, everybody's going to be surprised and they're going to wonder what happened and and so I think that's maybe part of it. It's that just she's been part of this volleyball machine, and then she's going and possibly playing rugby at an Ivy League school in the United States.
Passing a banana bread across the back line.
Yeah, there you go.
Try with this loaf of banana bread. If someone
banana bread ever.
If someone just happens to dip in and out of these talks, they're going to think it's like some kind of a gastronomy.
Certainly hungry.
Rob Gray was talking about what was it? An a la carte menu at a restaurant.
The buffet.
Yeah.
The buffet. Yes, we were. Yep.
It's Lauren's background in hospitality again. We're always coming back.
Yeah. The restaurants, the menus. Yeah, good. I'm hungry, guys, and it's 5:00. So
on that subject, as my family arrive home and the new puppy, as we were talking about dogs earlier on, begins to tear the house apart, I feel that's an uplifting moment to bring our 2 hour and 8 minute conversation to a close.
Wow.
Guys, I always say these conversations always fly by, but that one genuinely has. And we covered a lot of ground, and fields and menus.
Jumped a few walls.
I jumped a few walls. But
yeah.
I do you know what? I enjoyed every second of that, and I know we only really kind of delved into your challenge, and David, I promise we'll go to yours in a future panel. And Ed, we never got anywhere near yours, but hey, I've really enjoyed every second, and thank you for your time joining me on the panel this week.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you very much.
We'll have the next one at the opening of the Talent Equation Cafe.
There you go.
Okay, cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.